These videos are going to be looking at World War II. I'm going to divide them up into three parts. The first part primarily looking at all of the causes of the war, and you're going to see that there are actually a lot of similarities between the lead up to World War I and World War II, as well as the overall war course itself, and to a certain extent the aftermath. So in terms of the lead up to World War I and World War II. In both instances, you're going to see that the U.S. starts out from a position of neutrality, and then a series of events are gradually going to sort of threaten the sense of U.S. Security, and then it will culminate with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which ultimately very quickly prompts the U.S. to enter the war. So in terms of the overall threat to democracy, one of the major things that we know was developing in Europe going into World War II was that major countries were controlled by totalitarian governments. In Italy, you see Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, over here to the left. And then in Germany, of course, Adolf Hitler's totalitarian government as well in Germany, with the rise of the Third Reich in Germany. So basically you're going to see that as these all-powerful leaders emerge in European countries, other Western European countries as well as the United States start to see them as a threat to the democracy that they were trying to protect after World War I. And even though it doesn't prompt the U.S. to get involved immediately, it does certainly heighten its awareness of some of the tensions that exist in Europe. Additionally, we're going to see that the Japanese are becoming increasingly aggressive in terms of their participation in imperialism. So we know that Japan was an imperial power before World War I, but we don't really talk about an involvement in World War I. We talk about the Japanese involvement in World War II. And a lot of this is because Japan actually extends its imperial influence after World War I. As of 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria, so just north of China. They establish their own colony, which they call Manchukuo, and then they formally detach Manchukuo from China in this period. They oftentimes confine Manchu people to really harsh conditions, forced them to work manual labor under the Japanese supervision, many of whom died and were just buried in mass graves. And so you sort of see this colonization of the on the part of the Japanese against the Manchu people, which is in some ways very similar to some of the other instances of imperialism that we saw before World War I. After World War II ends, though, we are going to see Manchuria get restored to China. But because of the invasion of Manchuria, Japan is called out by the League of Nations, basically because they're not allowing a place like Manchuria to exercise self-determination. So Japan actually withdraws from the League of Nations in 1933 after it is essentially disciplined by the League of Nations for invading Manchuria. One of the more devastating events that again highlights Japanese aggression is the rape of Nanking, which takes place shortly before the start of World War II in 1937. So after the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese increase their imperial control over China. And this really culminates with the rape of Nanking, which was where they invaded the city of Nanking. They committed mass murder and mass rape of the population. And the records vary considerably based on where the source is coming from. The Chinese sources estimate that the casualty rate in the rape of Nanking was about 300,000. Some records are smaller than this. The Japanese records themselves were destroyed, so it's difficult to get a count from their perspective. But nonetheless, what we do know is that it was a devastating event for China. It was certainly an event that shows that the Japanese were very aggressive in their attempt to control the Chinese. And it is going to heighten the awareness of other countries. They're going to see Japan as an increased threat, and Of course, this is only going to worsen once we see Japan try to increase its control over the Pacific as well. Italy is also getting involved in the age of imperialism, albeit a little bit late, but at the same time, this is going to make increasing European countries and the US very wary of what Italy is attempting to do. Italy first invades Ethiopia, or as it was called at that point, Abyssinia. This is actually left over from the previous age of imperialism going into World War I. Italy actually attempted to invade Ethiopia before World War I and was unsuccessful. And so when Mussolini takes power in the 1920s, he again launches an invasion on Ethiopia. This time it's successful, and Italy takes it over and establishes rule in Ethiopia. So in some ways, it's kind of Italy's attempt to establish retribution after their failed attempt to control Ethiopia in the early 20th century. So in addition to just the actual invasion of Ethiopia, during the period of aggression that results, you're going to have the same kind of death toll that you saw in the rape of Nanking. Estimates say about 275,000 Ethiopians were killed when Italy occupied the country. And Italy also extends its influence to other areas of Africa, like Eritrea, which is just north of Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, and they also invade Albania, which is in the Balkan states. So, right here. So what we see is that the League of Nations responds by essentially calling out Italy, saying that it is committing aggressive acts, but it doesn't actually do anything to stop Mussolini. So again, we're seeing that these countries, like Italy, like Germany, like Japan, are becoming increasingly aggressive, but the League of Nations doesn't really find any way to actually stop them. Another thing that's even more prominent is that Germany is starting to rearm itself, which is definitely, first off, a repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler gives a speech in 1933 that deliberately denounces the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the provision that required Germany to pay reparations to the Allied nations. And then as Germany rearms itself, it's going to basically start to try to spread the Third Reich's influence over other countries in Eastern Europe. And this starts several years before the war actually starts. So in 1935, the Germans are going to invade the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. So it's this region in sort of the mustard yellow color over here. And then after that, Germany is also going to cede this part of Czechoslovakia to Hungary. So basically, we're going to have the partitioning, the carving up of Czechoslovakia, so that these two different aggressive powers are basically going to take control over it. You're also going to have in 1935 the Nuremberg laws, which were very harsh policies that were meant to restrict the rights of Jews living in the Nazi regime. So they restricted citizen rights for Jews. They forbade intermarriage between Germans and Jews. They forbade Jews from working in certain jobs, like for the government or for teaching, because basically they were afraid that there would be too much of a Jewish influence over the Nazi population. And in addition to the Nuremberg laws, in the same year, or my apologies, it's a couple of years later, but arguably a result of the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht, which translates into the Night of the Broken Glass, was a systematic and coordinated attack on Jews throughout the Reich region. You see in this center image down here, this is a synagogue burning during Kristallnacht. And what you see here is that there are fire hoses that are actually trying to put out the fire spreading onto houses next to the synagogue, but the fire company was making no effort at all to stop the synagogue from burning. So you definitely get a sense that even law enforcement was sort of supporting the Nazi efforts of Kristallnacht, while the Jewish population was scapegoated and also victimized. And then also in 1936, the Summer Olympic Games were held in the German capital of Berlin. So this was an opportunity for Hitler, for some of the propaganda ministers in the Third Reich, to really attempt to uh, sort of glorify the strength of the Nazi regime. They also were trying to outdo previous Olympic ceremonies. In particular, the last Summer Olympic Games, 4 years before this, were held in Los Angeles. So Hitler was really trying to outdo what the Americans did in their Olympics. Hitler did try to forbid Jews from participating in the Olympic Games, but then there was a threat of a boycott by other athletes, so he gave in. And here we see just an image from the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and this is the runner carrying the Olympic torch. But what's more prominent is the swastika signs throughout the background. So basically, the Olympics always brings a lot of tourism and, to a certain extent, nationalism to the region that's hosting it. And so this was a way that Hitler tried to sort of glorify the strength of the Third Reich and tried to show it off to the rest of the world. What you're going to see is that throughout the 1930s, the U.S. is still very skeptical about entering any sort of military conflict. You're going to see that after World War I, the Americans again sort of retreat back towards a position that supported isolationism. By the mid-1930s even, most Americans concluded that going into World War I even was a serious mistake. So you are going to see some groups of people sort of organize against future wars. College students, the nation's youth in particular, seem to be much more in favor of a pacifist approach to foreign policy. And even Congress responds at first by passing a series of neutrality acts throughout the 1930s. And basically what the neutrality acts did was they limited the sale of munitions. So basically, they limited the sale of arms to countries that were at war. So the U.S. is looking increasingly skeptical at countries like Italy, for example, because of their increasing expansion into Africa. And so basically, these neutrality acts forbade trade with a country like Italy because they were seen as belligerent. You're also going to see that some Americans actually organize into peace-promoting organizations, and one of the best examples of that was the America First Committee. And you can see some of their advertisements here. All three of these were actually put together by the America First Committee. And basically, the agenda of these committees was to try to promote non-intervention, so to try to keep America from staying out of military conflicts. And the America First Committee actually became the largest anti-war organization in American history. By the time World War I started in Europe, there were over 800,000 members of America First. But interestingly, the committee completely dissolves 3 days after the Pearl Harbor attacks. So you can see that it's easy for Americans to be anti-war when they don't have an actual military threat. But when there is a threat on American soil, the government very quickly makes an attempt to stop the opposition to war. So in Europe, the war begins first. So looking at it from the American perspective, we are going to pay less attention to what is happening in the war when it's just European countries involved, but it's important for us to realize that Europe is already at war for 2 years by the time the U.S. actually enters in 1941. So what happens at first is that after the Soviet Union and Germany launch a joint invasion on Poland, you're going to see that there's going to be a quick declaration of war by France and Britain against Germany. So the Nazi military was much stronger in World War II than the German military was arguably in World War I. In particular, the Nazis are effective in using their air force to try to collectively bomb areas. So the Nazi air force really pounded on Britain in 1940. And as a response, even though the U.S. was not involved, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushed to increase the amount of money that it spent on military provisions. So basically what you see is that as the European involvement in war escalates, you're going to see that FDR is sort of pushing towards military preparedness. So his argument was that by doing this, this was sort of a strategy of defense, so to speak. you also are going to see that the Nazi control of Western Europe is going to elevate very quickly due to their blitzkrieg techniques. Blitzkrieg translates into lightning war. Basically, what you're going to see is that in a very quick period of time, Germany is going to expand its occupation into all these countries that are represented in blue here on this map, including France, which is very significant. And basically, before American involvement in World War II, the Nazi threat was immense. Despite the fact that the Nazis were not able to successfully capture Britain, they still used some pretty relentless air campaigns against them. So basically, again, in 1940, FDR is not actually willing to go to war in Europe, but still he is paying increasing attention towards being prepared in a military sense. So in 1940, which was an election year, FDR basically argues in favor of increased military expenditures because he makes the argument that it's a strategy of hemispheric defense. FDR does win his third term, and then he starts to expand American involvement in military expenditures. First, he creates a security zone in most of the Atlantic, and then he also signs the Lend-Lease Act into legislation, and he institutes a draft. Okay, so before the U.S. actually gets involved in war, we already have a military draft. The Lend-Lease Act is significant because it marks the U.S. economic involvement in World War II, rather, sorry. What the Lend-Lease Act did was it gave the U.S. Permission to support the Allied nations, which were the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and France, with materials. So after the Lend-Lease Act was passed, the U.S. actually ships approximately $50 million worth of supply to Allied countries. And also, FDR meets Winston Churchill before the U.S. formally gets involved in the war. So Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You see him and FDR meeting down here. And what they agree upon is a document called the Atlantic Charter. What the Atlantic Charter did was it stated all of the war aims of the Allied countries. In some ways, you could compare this to the goals of the Treaty of Versailles. So some of the goals were things like freedom from fear, wants, and tyranny. Somewhat vague goals, but ultimately the idea was that they were already trying to outline what they thought the post-war world would look like. Then, the U.S. definitively can justify its involvement after the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor. And so what happened was the Japanese threatened to seize Europe's colonies in Asia, and in response, FDR decided to cut off trade with Japan. So once Japan essentially has its trade connections in the Pacific Islands blocked and Japan is no longer allowed to trade with the United States, the Japanese emperor responds by launching this attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. This happens on December 7th, 1941. The very next day, the U.S. responds by declaring war on Japan, and then 3 days after that, the U.S. also declares war on Germany and Italy, who were also the aggressors. And so the U.S. essentially gets involved in World War II for pretty similar reasons to their involvement in World War I. They start out with neutrality, although they at first increase their involvement just in an economic sense by providing the Allied nations with much-needed supplies. But then finally, just like World War I, once there is a tangible military threat upon the United States, they move ahead and declare war. So we'll stop here, and then we'll have another video that talks about the mobilization efforts as well as World War II on the home front. So stay tuned for that.